So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcel Crouse. I'm the Associate Deputy Minister in the Transportation Safety Division in Ontario. I'm also the Registrar for Ontario. And I'm also Ontario's representative on CCMTA Board of Directors. So I'll be your moderator for the last session today, which I think is also known as the session between you and happy hour, probably. So we'll try to keep it to the point. But I do think it's a really interesting one. So hopefully you all will agree. So the presentation, we have two presenters, and it will conclude with a Q&A session. So if you can just hold your questions to the end. The session is titled Road Safety Research, What Does It Tell Us? So I think it's fair to say that road safety research and data is critical to the work that we all do. And we're very fortunate in this session to have a seasoned road safety consultant, Paul Boyce, and Dr. Patrick Byrne from the Ontario Ministry of Transportation. And they will be sharing insights from recent road safety data and research, both within Canada and internationally. And this is directly relevant to development of the next National Road Safety Plan, which is coming right up. So we will start the session off with Paul Boyce. I think I'm saying his name, Boyce. Sorry, Paul, over to you.
Thank you. I realize we're standing between you and a hockey party, so we'll try to get this along smartly. Can we get the presentation up? There we go. Okay. Back up. So basically, I'm going to talk about some road safety data, what we use it for, where we get it. Then we're going to talk about international data sets that you can use to try to enhance your knowledge from other jurisdictions, and then talk about the UN Decade of Action, and finish off with our current standing in the world as of 2021, because as you've heard before, data are not exactly current. So Canada is made up of over 1 million kilometers of roadway, of which about just under half are paved. There's 17,000 kilometers of expressways, and the national highway system is 38,000 kilometers. We had about 16,000 fatal crashes with about 1,800 victims. We have 78,000 injuries, crashes, with about 8,000 seriously injured. So these are serious safety issues. The population at the time, this is 2021, was just over 38 million. An interesting fact I find, given that this is the second largest physical country in the world, 90% of our population lives within 100 kilometers of the US border. So we have a lot of people in some places, and we got a lot of empty space, which can be a challenge in terms of collecting data and medical treatment. So transportation is a key issue economically, socially, and safety. Collision data are important to track the health of the network and the safety of road users. And the sources of crash data currently are police reported, which are often left to the most serious crashes, fatals and injuries. You have self-reported in some jurisdictions, and in some jurisdictions you have insurance reported. So some of the data coming through is coming from a different pathway, which can have an impact. The data uses, obviously we count fatalities and injuries because that's important and we all report on that. It's also used to identify road safety challenges, dangerous spots on the road, dangerous driving behaviors, impaired driving, distracted driving, all of these things. It provides valuable data for public policy and legislation. I know that we've testified in front of Parliament with these data a number of times to try to get legislative change for the criminal code. It's used to develop and monitor the road safety strategy program. So we're currently on our 4th road safety strategy, preparing to do the 5th one. These data are important for that. It also populates what's known as NCDB Online. The provinces provide the federal government with the data. Transport Canada puts it online. It only reports common elements. Of all the data elements, it only reports about 88 because they're the only ones that are fully complete. And it only reports nationally. You can't get jurisdictional breakdowns from NCDB Online. There are some challenges with the data, with the national collision data, due to a lack of collection. So a jurisdiction may not ask a particular question, or they do ask the question and they give it the same name, but it has a different definition. And that can be very difficult when you're trying to pull that database together nationally. The timeliness of the data are always a problem, and has been for some time, and we'll talk in a second about some possible solutions to that. It can be difficult to understand. I've read many newspaper reports where they get the number of drivers and the number of cars and the number of fatalities all confused, and it can be difficult to understand if you're not used to them. Detailed crash investigations, TC has a number of teams. They are expensive. In fact, they only do between 200 and 250 investigations a year, and they're typically on something of special interest, a vehicle of special interest, a school bus, for example. Attempts are underway to develop an NCDB estimation model to be able to provide usable, timely national data. I understand that Accident Support Services is also using AI to create a predictive crash model. The importance of those models are that you're going to model it, and then the real data will come in and it'll allow you to update the model and better understand it and make the predictions stronger for next time. So that's a very powerful tool that will help shorten the time to make data available. Exposure data is an important measure because it measures the risks of people, of vehicles, and so on the road. There are many ways around the world that exposure data have been measured. Fuel sales is one. Population size, number of vehicles, number of drivers are other ones. And on highways, they use vehicle counts, or average annual daily traffic, or summer daily traffic, or winter daily traffic, to be able to estimate the exposure on those segments of road. Typical, these are gross estimates. They're not broken down by vehicle type, except sometimes trucks, not trucks, but they're not broken down by cars, minivans, they're not broken down by bicycles, pedestrians. All of these data are missing. And it can be difficult and expensive to collect. From 2000 to 2010, StatsCan oversaw the collection. Subsequent to that, Transport Canada used data collection devices in 4 provinces, so we had very good data in 4 provinces, but not all provinces signed on in the time that was available. CCMTA developed a model to estimate it, but the model was built, but there's no real data coming in later to update it. So that model's still around, but it's pretty old and outdated at this point. So exposure data remains a challenge. There are new technologies offered to update exposure data. The use of cell phones and tracking cell phones. Navigation systems, I know TomTom was doing that on their systems. Waze and Google Maps do it now. And one example of other technology is the streetlight mobility technology. If you're interested in this, you can go to their website, but they do a lot of mobility tracking using these phones. You have impaired driving data. Impaired driving data is a little bit different than the other data that we're used to because this is a criminal code offense. So an allegation is much more serious. So you have to be more careful. We also have alternative data collection for it. We have the fatality database by TURF, looking at fatally injured drivers and pedestrians and tracking that over time as a surrogate measure for impaired driving on the road. We have roadside nighttime surveys, daytime surveys, and commercial driver surveys to try to get estimates for alcohol and drugs in those populations. I'd note that that methodology is currently under review by CCMTA. And there's an old standby for single run-off-the-road crashes. If you have a single run-off-the-road crash that isn't attributed to another cause like speeding or weather, it's assumed to be alcohol. You have other sources of data, telephone surveys. CCMTA released one last year that has a lot of good data in it. You can do special topic surveys, observational surveys, cell phone use, and seat belts. CCMTA does. The impaired driving one we talked about. And a new technology that's come along more recently is naturalistic driving studies, where you just outfit a vehicle and you turn the driver loose for an extended period of time and say, just do what you normally do, and we're going to watch. And drivers are very quick to forget that they're being watched, and they go back to doing what they normally do. So a large one was done in Saskatoon on private vehicles, and I believe MTO just did one with commercial vehicles, a number of commercial vehicles being instrumented. But the technology for doing these are getting easier and cheaper, so hopefully these are methods that will be more frequent in the future. If we look internationally, because the provinces give us, or not us, it used to be us now, give Transport Canada the data. Transport Canada then reports it internationally. So you have the International Road Traffic Accident Database that began in 1988 in Germany. It was in response to requirements for comparisons across countries. It's currently being run by the OECD Joint Transportation Ministers. There's quite a large number of member countries that provide data. They compile standardized data for all countries, and they also support safety observations in developing countries. Part of the UN process is to help developing countries, and this is a good source for that. You can see on the other side the data elements. You have the standard crash data. It also has exposure data, population, and it has some safety equipment used that's in the database. So if you're looking for international data to compare your jurisdiction to, that's a good site. OECD has other databases. All these are generated by member reports. It's a standardized reporting format. It contains a number of data. We talked about EARTAT. They have a passenger transport, which tracks passenger movement. They have one for freight. They have one for vehicle registrations. And then they have two for infrastructure, investment, and maintenance. So if you're looking for international data, those are good sources to go to. All of this at the international level rolls up into the Global Status Report on Road Safety. It's overseen by the World Health Organization. It is an overview of the state of road safety country by country. For North America, the coordinator is the Pan American Health Organization, and then each country has a national data coordinator who is responsible for seeing that this massive questionnaire is filled out. And the questionnaire covers the waterfront, so nobody can answer it all. So you have to create a committee and get experts to input to each part of it. So this is a very detailed report. So the status report, quite often, especially before a ministerial high-level meeting, contains a country page. What you're seeing there is the Canadian country page. But the important thing of this is each country has one page like this. It's all reported in the same way with the same definitions, so you can compare across jurisdictions. That can be very valuable. It addresses safety by region, and it addresses it by countermeasures, and it promotes best practices and countermeasures where it finds them. And as I say, quite often it contains this country report. So the last report was from 2023. It didn't contain a country report because there was no high-level meeting coming up before it, but it found that 84 countries have dedicated road safety plans, or dedicated agencies. 117 have a dedicated road safety plan. The fundings for the plan come from one of two places typically. It comes from government funding or it comes from a special tax that's imposed on the jurisdiction. And it also found that motor vehicle or transport crashes are the leading cause of death for people 5 to 29-year-olds. And over that, it's the 12th leading cause of death. So this remains a serious issue. Back at the, when we hit the year 2000, they had something called the Millennium Development Goals, because Millennium was a big project back then. But those eventually morphed into the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see them here. There are 17 goals. They cover everything, cities, safety, everything. The two that are most relevant to us are under health, 3.4, to reduce fatalities by 50%, and 11.2, a safe and sustainable and equitable transportation for all of the population. There are a number of other sub-goals that have some relevance, but those are the two important ones. So what happened is the United Nations decided that this was so broad that things were getting lost in it. People couldn't really figure out what to do, so they came up with 12 very specific goals for road safety to promote the 50% reduction. And if you look at these, I don't know if you can really read them, but the colors mean something on the side. The turquoise colors are management things. You need a management plan, you need funding. The green is vehicles, about safe vehicles. The yellow are safe infrastructure, and then the bulk of them, purple, are road users. So that should give you a fair indication of where they see a bulk of the problem. It's all about road users, it's about helmet use, speed, impaired driving. If you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to go and look at these. But what you'll find out is that road safety strategy, the current version, covers most of these in Canada. So we're meeting most of these now. And the work going on at CCMTA, even now and going forward, will continue to do that. So the new plan, which is 2021 to 2030, it's the second generation. It's been boiled down to this informatic, but it essentially talks about what to do, how to do it, and who to do it. And the green is what to do, lowering speed limits, infrastructure, safe vehicles. The how to do it, the 30 kilometer speed limit where vehicles and pedestrians, cyclists, micro-mobility devices interact, which a number of cities have started doing around the world. It involves justice, it involves funders. And then the who to do it, the typical players are there, the government, safety organizations, but they've added private sector and specific funders as part of that. So that's the enhancement in the new program. So the new program is very similar to the first road safety plan, which was 2011 to 2020. But what they've added is land use planning. You don't just let buildings go up and then figure out how to service it through transport. You need to bake that in for the safest transportation possible. There's a bigger push on lowering speed limits to 30, as I said. There's an increased focus on equity in transportation, especially in developing countries where not everybody can afford, a vehicle that has a lot of safety equipment. It involves civil society, private sector, and funders. That's new in this model. And the one thing I'd say about this is Canada has great post-crash care, but what we don't have is a strong link to those data so that we can report on it. Because the database requires us to report a lot of health information, and we don't have easy access to that. So that's our one weakness that I can see moving forward in this. So if we look at where we're at, if you just look at these, the two lines, the brown and the gray going up, that's the number of licensed drivers and the number of registered vehicles. You can see the reference year is 1975, and that has doubled up to 2021. If we had done nothing, one might expect that fatalities and serious injuries would have been on a similar trajectory. But if you look at the blue lines at the bottom, that's fatalities and serious injuries. They're down 60% despite those increases. If you think about that for a second, it strikes me as that is a fairly good measure of how successful the jurisdictions, CCMTA, safety groups have been in terms of addressing the transportation problem. But if you look at the 2021 numbers, you can see that we still have some room to go because it's still a significant problem. And because we're talking international data, this is what the rates per million population in 2021. You can see the red bar there is Canada. You can see the countries that are in front of us. And the blue bar, just because we always like to beat the Americans, is the US. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul. And as I said, we will take questions at the end. I realized that I neglected to properly introduce Paul. I won't go through his whole bio. Many of you know him. But Paul has had a long and distinguished career in road safety. He began his career with Ministry of Transportation in Ontario. Too bad we didn't keep him. As a research analyst, and then moved to Transport Canada as manager of road users. He retired from Transport Canada at the end of last year and currently sits on the board of directors of the Canadian Association of Road Safety Professionals. He is now working as a road safety consultant, and so we're very lucky to have him today. So now we will turn to our second presentation from Dr. Patrick Byrne. And Patrick does work at Ministry of Transportation in Ontario. We are very fortunate to have him in my division. He is a team leader in the Research and Evaluation Office, and he leads applied road safety research projects in areas such as commercial vehicle safety, driver training, alcohol and drug impaired driving, and aggressive driving. Patrick has authored several papers in transportation-related journals and has published research articles in numerous peer-reviewed journals related to human perception, cognition, and motor action. So please welcome Patrick.
Thank you, Marcel. And thank you, CCMTA, for having me here. So Paul began by talking about data. And data, of course, is what we use when we're trying to understand what kind of problem we have and, what's going wrong. And then he led into some general conversation about road safety strategy. And what I want to do is I want to kind of continue with some of that conversation around road safety strategy, which is what we use to fix our problems, but maybe with more specific reference to what Canada's road safety strategy should look like, or not necessarily so much what it should look like, but what I believe are some important considerations for that strategy. Interestingly, when I was asked to speak here, I thought I had 60 minutes, and so I had this absolute ton of things I wanted to talk about, but now I've tried to narrow it down to what I think are maybe about 3 or 4 of the most important ones. So you may or may not disagree, but I'm happy to talk about the other ones if you want. So what I'll do is I'll just look back at RSS 2025 a little bit and just, what were some of its main components and where have we come with it. And then in terms of a new road safety strategy, I want to talk about 3 areas that we might want to keep in mind when developing that strategy. So first, I want to reassert that safe systems is the way to go, but maybe a safe systems-based road safety strategy with a little more specificity in it in certain areas. Also, I want to talk about prioritizing reduced exposure, which is something that when we talk about safe systems in Vision Zero, we often don't talk a lot about. And finally, a strategy that's realistic. It's important for strategies to be realistic, I think, to preserve credibility and keep people who are working on them motivated. So first, let's just look at RSS 2025. This was a safe systems-based strategy, and it can be probably best illustrated by its most, I think, practical component, which is this matrix. And so with this matrix, you see risk factors down the risk groups down the left-hand side, so young drivers, vulnerable road users, that sort of thing, and then contributing factors along the top. And interestingly, those contributing factors are broken down. It may be a little bit difficult to see here, but essentially along the safe systems pillars. So for example, alcohol impaired driving, distracted driving, these all correspond to safer road users. We have vehicle factors for safer vehicles, road infrastructure for safer roads, and so on. So the safe systems approach is built in here. And you can go to the RSS webpage and you can put in your risk group and your contributing factor, and it'll give you a great list of promising and proven countermeasures that we can use to reduce risk in that area. Of course, in any new road safety strategy, we'll need to update that now because they may be a little bit dated. But let's just see what we've done with the road safety strategy. Okay. So what I've plotted here are fatality rates in Canada per 10,000 licensed drivers, per 10,000 registered vehicles, and the orange one is per 10,000 population. So you can see the trends all mirror each other quite a bit. RSS 2025 was put in place in 2015, and in 4 of the 7 years for which I'm showing data here, you can see we actually did achieve our goal of towards zero in the sense of getting better from the previous year. Unfortunately, since the pandemic, we're kind of curving back up a little bit. And so a new road safety strategy really is going to have to tackle that issue and reassert a downward trend. So where do we start? I'm going to assert again that safe systems is the right place to be. And just to illustrate that, I want to show Sweden and Norway. And of course, they both legislatively committed to Vision Zero in 1997 and 2001, respectively. And Vision Zero is where the safe systems approach came from. And if you look at their fatality rates per population, you can see they decreased by almost 70% for each of these countries between the time they implemented Vision Zero and the present. This is more so than what we've seen in Canada. And in fact, it's especially interesting in Norway, because if I went back before they implemented Vision Zero, both of these countries were on a downward trend, but the downward trend actually was 3 times higher for Norway after implementation. So Norway made a fantastic improvement at the time they implemented Vision Zero. And currently, as of 2022, they're the safest, in terms of road safety, they're the safest country in the world. And so I want to pay special attention to what Norway did. What did they do that we can learn from? So if you look at the safe systems pillars and say, which of these pillars did their improvement actually come from? There was a study done in 2014 by Huya. My Norwegian is terrible, but I think that's how you pronounce her name. And anyway, she looked at where the improvements from 2000 to 2012 came from. And 34% of the improvement came from safer vehicles. So that's having turnover in the vehicle fleet and bringing in things like electronic stability control to reduce rollovers and that sort of thing. But just as much, a full third pretty much of the improvement came from speed reduction, so reducing speed limits. Road user behavior contributed to maybe 15%. Right here we have 10%, which is just in relation to young drivers and increased seatbelt use, but there was a number of other road user factors as well. Infrastructure contributed to 5.5% of the improvement, which is quite interesting. It doesn't mean that that's the only potential these particular pillars have to make improvement, but that's how they panned out in Norway. So that's what happened in Norway, but how did Norway do it? So right now, Norway is on their sixth fourth-year plan. So for a couple of decades, they've developed national road safety plans. And we can learn a lot, I think, from how they develop their plan or what their plan looks like. They have 15 priority areas, so you have speeding, impaired driving, seatbelts, all of that kind of wonderful stuff. On the bottom, I've highlighted two that I think may have been a little underemphasized in RSS 2025, which is using new technology, but not just in vehicles, for enforcement and for other things as well. And also research and data collection. We can't know what to do if we don't know what's happening out there. Interestingly, for these 15 priority areas, they also have a total of 179 specific actions listed in their road safety plan, okay? And each of these actions has commitment from stakeholders before it's even put in their plan. Each action will also be followed up formally in a couple of years, and a report back to Parliament has to happen on progress that's been made for all of these 179 actions. And in addition, they have specific KPIs that have to be tracked to targets for each of the priority areas. So let me just show you what that looks like a little bit more in practice. So here are 4 actions I picked at pseudo-random from the road safety plan. The first one says, the police in cooperation with Norwegian Public Roads Administration will use regional speed data for knowledge-based speed enforcement activities. The second one will be that the NPRA will carry out systematic surveys of roadways to see where roads invite people to drive too fast. I'll just go to the fourth one. The fourth one, Oslo University Hospital will carry out a roadside survey to determine the extent of intoxication in traffic. There are 3 really important points I want to make that just you can see in these actions. But again, there's 175 other ones that can make the same points. First of all, there's a high degree of specificity in terms of who has committed to doing what. Second, there's an emphasis on the role of enforcement. We can have all the best legislation in the world, you know, anti-speeding laws, whatever, anti-impaired driving countermeasures. If they're not enforced, they're of no use. The problem is we know that people operating outside of system limits, like through impaired driving and through speeding, is still incredibly common across Canada. And we can't just keep dumping money into enforcement to get more and more enforcement to stop that. We really have to look more towards technology to help us. And so we have things like automated speed enforcement coming out in a lot of places across the country. But you know, in Australia now, they use artificial intelligence-based cameras to look in people's cars and see if they're distracted driving, seeing if they're wearing seatbelts. There was a pilot done in Edmonton with that technology, right? And I understand that there are certain privacy concerns around the use of artificial intelligence and cameras that look in people's cars. But we really need to, you know, put our heads together, I think, and figure out how do we help our enforcement partners with these new technologies? We have to find creative ways to use them. The third thing that happens in Norway's plan is there's an emphasis on research and data collection, which is something I really didn't see a lot of in RSS 2025. And I think it's somewhere where we really need to, you know, more specifically say what needs to be done, who's going to do it. And of course, as I said, the plan has specific KPIs as well. So for example, by 2026, there should be fewer than 0.1% of drivers with a BAC of over 0.02%. So that's sort of a little bit of a rant on safe systems and, you know, a more specific version of it for RSS, well, a future RSS. The next thing I want to do is start talking a little bit about exposure. So when we talk about safe systems and Vision Zero, we often talk about preventing collisions or reducing the severity of the impact of collisions. But one thing we don't often acknowledge explicitly is that you can't have a collision if you're not driving a car. So if we look at Oslo as an example, in 2015, you can see they'd had a strong upturn in the number of serious roadway injuries that happened within that city. So in 2015, they implemented their car-free livability program. There was a couple of goals to that program. One of them was to improve safety. Another one was just to reduce pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. And so what they did is they removed over 700 parking spots from the core of the city. They installed over 60 kilometers of bike lanes, and they instituted congestion charges in the city center, so you had to pay money to get in. And you can see from 2015 to 2019, the number of serious injuries dropped quite significantly to a number that was lower than any other number that's on this graph. And in 2019, there was only one fatality in Oslo. There was a little bit of a blip there in 2020 in association with the pandemic, but again, in 2021, only one fatality. What Oslo recognized, again, is that driving itself is actually the greatest risk factor on our roads. And you can see that clearly in this data. So what this data is, I'm sorry, the graph could be a little clearer, so I apologize for that, but each symbol on this graph is a country, okay? And along the x-axis, what you have is how much the average citizen of that country drives, okay? So to the right, the average person drives more, to the left, they drive less. And fatality rate up the side. And so look, you can see the United States in the upper right-hand corner. People in the United States drive a lot, and they have a really high fatality rate. Okay, but if you look at countries like Norway or Japan, they're on the other end, Canada somewhere in the middle, all right? Now, there's variability here, so if exposure was the only risk factor, all those countries would line up on that dashed line that you can see there. Okay, so we know there's other things going on. It's not just exposure, it's how good you are at preventing speeding, how good you are at preventing drinking and driving. But fully 65% of the difference between the high and low fatality rate countries is explained by how much driving they do. So it is the single largest risk factor. It was interesting, a guy named Ferenczak did a study of Vision Zero adopting cities in the United States, 18 Vision Zero adopting cities. And he found that after taking a Vision Zero pledge, 5 of those cities actually became worse, increased fatality rates. 11 cities didn't change at all. 2 cities got better. What's the difference between those cities? The only difference he could identify from a statistical perspective was that the cities that got worse had more people driving around as an individual person in their own car, right? Whereas the cities that got better had more people in a multiple people in vehicle situation, more use of transit, probably because they have better transit systems and better mobility options. But the point is that if you want safe systems in Vision Zero to work, part of it is going to have to be getting people out of cars, which sounds like a very anti-car thing to say, but unfortunately that is what the data tells us. So how do we do that? Okay, sorry, actually there's one more slide I just wanted to show you as well, just to illustrate the importance of public transit. So this data is from 2000, but I don't imagine it would be any different if we looked at it today. What we have here is every symbol in the graph is actually a city, okay, from the US, from Europe, from Australia. And along the bottom is how much they use public transit. So the more your citizens use public transit, the further to the right you are along this graph, okay? And fatality rate, again, is up the side. And so what it shows is that if your citizens use more public transit, you're gonna have a lower fatality rate. So overall, what we wanna do is somehow get people out of cars, get them into transit. So what kind of actions do we need to encourage in a road safety strategy? Do we need to think about encouraging telework, carpooling, right? Encouraging active transit, at least where we can separate people with infrastructure from vehicles, enhancing the availability, the quality, the affordability of public transit, making sure our communities are complete so that people live in the same places that the services are, so they don't have to drive as much, and supporting the development of mobility as a service so people can get door to door, mostly relying on public transit. Okay, and the final thing I want to talk about is a little bit about being realistic, right? And when you look at safe systems in Vision Zero, and when you look at RSS 2025, you find sentences like this: human life and health are paramount and take priority over mobility and other objectives of the road safety traffic system, or road traffic system. The health and life can never be exchanged for mobility, essentially. If I said I disagreed with that, you'd all hate me immediately, right? Because we care about people. But when you look at what the data says, Just look at this table on the left, for example. This is from Norway. And it's actually a measurement of how well Norway complies with the different pillars of safe systems, okay? So one of the key pillars of safe systems is safe speeds. And if 0 was no compliance with setting the speed limits where they should be, and 1 was perfect compliance, Norway's at 0.17. So even the best country in the world, the safest roads in the world, the one that I was holding up as an example that we should learn from, has trouble complying with things like reducing mobility by lowering speed limits, okay? And even in North America, since 1987, speed limits on US freeways have been going up. In the last decade or two, lots of Canadian jurisdictions have raised speed limits on freeways. The point is we have to be realistic. We can't expect jurisdictions to let safety override everything else. Similarly, safe systems and Vision Zero type language usually suggests we shouldn't do any cost-benefit analysis. In Ontario in 2021, there was over 7,000 unintentional deaths, of which 7.5% or 561 were motor vehicle collision deaths. If I can spend X dollars and save one life in a motor vehicle collision context, that's great. But if I could use the same X dollars and save 10 people by hiring more doctors and nurses, for example, it would be unethical for me to use that in the context of the motor vehicle or the road safety system. So what I'm trying to say here is just that we should have strategies that are realistic, have ambitious goals, but we want to maintain credibility and motivation by not telling people we can do things that we can't do. So in summary, I think safe systems is still the most promising approach for a road safety strategy. We need to update our countermeasures that work, but we really need to think about putting in a menu, perhaps, of concrete actions that jurisdictions can choose from if they want to develop their own road safety plans. We need to emphasize enforcement, including relying on new technology, emphasize data collection and research-driven approaches, certainly emphasize reducing exposure, getting people out of their cars into active transit or active transportation and transit, and creating realistic goals so that we keep people motivated and we keep ourselves credible. Thank you.